All right. Thanks everyone for joining today. I think that there will still be a few more folks that are joining us as we continue, but we will get started now. My name is Sabrina Grover, and I am joining you today from Calgary, Alberta, on the traditional territory of the Treaty 7 people. In the spirit of reconciliation, I acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, and the Métis Nation Region 3, as well as all of the people who make their homes in Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I also wanted to share my gratitude and respect to all Indigenous peoples from all nations across Turtle Island. They are the traditional guardians of the land upon which we live and work, and I acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory. I wanted to thank everyone here for joining the 2023 CanWatch Academy. The Academy is designed to provide a convenient, accessible learning platform for our members, our colleagues, and our peers. The sessions that we've offered this week respond to the professional development and learning needs and interests that our members have shared with us. We're pleased to provide this opportunity to support our members in this way and look forward to a great week of learning with you. Before diving into the session, there's just a few housekeeping items I wanted to share. You may note that simultaneous translation is available in English and French. You can click on the globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen to select your language of preference. Both myself and the speakers in this session will be speaking in English predominantly. The session is being recorded, and the recording will be shared in the coming weeks on our website. And today's discussion will also include a Q&A session. If you have any questions during the presentation, please include them in the chat box, and we'll be doing our best to address them at the end of the presentation. We'll also have a bit of a Q&A in the middle of the session during our conversation with Martin Fisher from World Vision. So we'll go back and forth to the questions as we need. And if you have any technical difficulties during the discussion, including translation, please write a message to Charmaine Crockett in the chat box. All right, so seeing no questions as of right now, I am just going to get started here. So bear with me for one moment while I share my screen. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see that. Let me know if you can't, or I guess post it in the chat box. So this is just a quick recap of where the simultaneous translation piece is. All right, so the way we've kind of broken up this session is in kind of 3 chunks, including a bit of a case study analysis. So I wanted to start really high level, thinking about policymaking. What is it? Who's in charge? What do we expect as an outcome? And then we want to dig a little bit deeper into your role as government relations professionals, advocacy professionals, communications professionals, and how you and your organization can advance some of your government relations needs and what the government might be looking for in those instances. We'll have a case study on a conversation with Martin Fisher on the World Vision and the success of, or the ongoing success story, I guess, of Bill C-41 with respect to getting aid to Afghanistan. And then we'll end with a bit more of a practical piece that speaks to the actual engagement pieces, the consultation and committee pieces, and how you can practically get into government relations. Also, there will be a one-pager that we'll share at the end of the session. It'll be in the chat, and then we'll also be emailing it, and that kind of covers everything that we've presented here, as well as goes into a little bit more of the more practical side of policymaking. So I want to be really clear on setting the stage here. We're going to be digging into specifically the policy-making angle of government relations. Government relations is quite wide. It can include funding asks, it can include legislative changes, but for this session, we're going to focus specifically on policymaking, and specifically within that, the international development and health sector. So the first thing I want to emphasize is that policy work is slow. There are often organizations who have maybe been pushing for policy for 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. And so the lesson really to be learned is that that work is very incremental, it's slow. And because the change is going through multiple layers, from a departmental level to a ministerial level, and sometimes all the way up to the Prime Minister's office, the whole policymaking process can be somewhat slow. On the other hand, if a government is really motivated by an outcome or an incident or something that they're responding to, in those instances, you can see policymaking go from 0 to 100. And that motivation piece is really important to recognize. And it's important to understand motivations as a way to both temper your expectations, but also be able to respond to the changing narrative of government. Policy ideation, so the ideas behind the policies that government makes, comes from a number of different sources. One of those includes engagement with stakeholders like those of us on the call today. And most often, the government are not specialists. They are generalists, including generally in the minister's office. In the department, they are specialists. But the reason why I mention that is that really the specialists in the sector are us. They're the organizations, they're the people here, and they're the folks that we employ that are bringing forward these ideas to government. And so it's important to recognize that, because as a specialist, you bring something important to government in that relationship. And so policy ideation from our side, where stakeholder consultations and engaging with organizations like the ones on this call today, that's an important part of the way that policy is developed in the government. In global health and international development, policy is the key way that the government defines its priorities and will signal its intentions for funding and investment in projects, multilateral organizations, and mobilization campaigns, those of like the GFF or Gavi, or during the COVID period, the COVAX campaigns. So policy is how the government essentially defines its priority implications for where it would like to fund. And so there's kind of two sides to that, as I described. So policy will help you push the government on funding priorities, and then funding will help you actually get the investment into those projects that you're looking for. So both go hand in hand. And on this side, again, we're talking mostly about the policy pieces. One of the key pieces about policy making is that not all of it is going to be fully baked out into its own documentation or its own iteration. The most influential way of engaging in policy, both with the department and with ministers' offices or with the political side of government, is to engage in existing frameworks or areas of prioritization in order to increase the efficiency of getting things accomplished. So that's not always true. There are some examples where we have started from scratch and we've really ramped up from 0 to 100 in building an entire policy. But there's also examples where over the course of the development of a big policy, as time goes on and we need to influence it or change it, that it makes more sense for organizations to come together and try to leverage changes at a very iterative level or at a very micro level, so that those pieces become new priorities within existing frameworks. So let's look at some examples of big policy that the government has done, specifically the Liberal government, in the international development and global health space. Obviously, the one that we're most familiar with, I would say almost everyone on this call, would be the Feminist International Assistance Policy. So that's the guiding feminist framework for the Liberals' investment in international development and global health, which seeks to prioritize gender equality and gender transformative work. As an example of how integrating policy into that framework might have happened or has happened in the past, one sector that has been influential in changing key priorities and outcomes and increasing the gender responsiveness of the government's activities has been the nutrition sector. And so if you look at the evolution of the FIAP and the way that the government has reported on the FIAP, as well as its project investments and its general funding pools, nutrition has become a greater and greater part of the feminist international assistance policy and the way the government responds to programs and problems in the world. And so instead of creating, for example, a standalone nutrition policy or a nutrition investment guideline or a nutrition feminist transformative work, a piece of policy, the best way for that part of the sector to advance its priorities was to increase and expand the framework of FIAP, which is already baked in and which already has the buy-in of government, both department and the minister's office, and to try and expand that framework to increase the prioritization of specific areas within nutrition. And so that's kind of an example of how you don't always need to start from scratch. Sometimes you're going to build into what already exists. FIAP on its own, though, is an example of where you do start from scratch. And when the government decides to engage in really massive policy building, like they did with FIAP, or potentially if the government changes in the next, it changes hands when they build new programs, that's when they really engage with stakeholders and reach out to organizations like ourselves in order to get those ideas, to get those priorities, to get the KPIs, and to better understand the challenges in the sector. So one such example is Canada's policy for civil society partnerships for international assistance, a feminist approach. So this is a relatively new policy that the government has put forward for development. It's just starting to engage in the stakeholder pieces where it's setting out the accountability frameworks and the actual, intent of the policy, or more details on the intent of the policy. And in that sense, it's working with civil society organizations to maximize the impact and the results of Canada's international assistance and foster a strong and vibrant civil society sector. So that's an example where you can see, over the course of the last, say, 7 years that the government has been in power, they've seen maybe from consultations with stakeholders, from conversations with civil society, from internal workings of the department, that the engagement with civil society isn't going as well as it could be, or that there's a need for a framework. And so that's where that policy has come out of. And so that's why I kind of want to go back to my first point, the idea that policymaking is slow. Sometimes you might identify a problem today, but the government might not see that problem as something that's a challenge until 5 years from now. And so it's always important to remember that even though it feels like you're being repetitive, that you've put out this message 7 times, that you've done all this work and the government hasn't picked it up, you may see that you've said it 1,000 times. They've probably still only heard it maybe 10 times. And so I think it's really important when we build policy to have that perspective and to be able to recognize that as we go forward. And last but not least, I just want to describe kind of the ways in which practically organizations on this call can understand the government's priorities, and where you may have an opportunity to understand where policy could be influenced. The most specific way for that would be the departmental plans that are put out by Global Affairs on a yearly basis, as well as combined with that, the mandate letters, which are put out for ministers, generally at the beginning of a new parliamentary session or in conjunction with a cabinet shuffle. So the mandate letters that ministers are working with right now were given out in 2021. And the departmental plan that the department is working with is for 2023-2024. So the departmental plans, if you look into them, and we'll give you the links, I'll put them in the chat after, will frame the policy objectives and priorities for this year with key indicators, so actual outcomes that the government expects, as well as the key ways in which those will be financed that combine the long-term vision. So for example, SDGs and poverty eradication with the context of current events like the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so you can see how something like that might frame a food security or hunger and nutrition policy and priority investment over the course of the year. So that's a really specific way that you as an organization are able to access government resources, better understand what the priorities are, and better understand where the policy that you're working on or the issues you're working on fit in with those priorities over the course of a year or over the course of a session. All right. Moving right along. So the next session we want to talk about, on this section, we want to talk about what you need to be able to do to provide government with the tools for effective policymaking and how, as an organization, you're able to influence this policy. So, as I mentioned, it's really important to recognize that you are the experts in the field. Government decision makers, bureaucratic, political, all sorts of decision makers in the government are still generalists. Even if they work in a specific department, that could be maternal health, that could be the Africa Trade Desk, that could be the India Desk, they're still relying at the end of the day on the information that stakeholders provide them in order to make policy priorities, in order to identify their KPIs, and to make the funding decisions necessary to advance projects. So policy is important because it provides the evidence base for governments to make decisions. And that's why the relationship that you will build with government stakeholders, whether that's political, like in the minister's office, the chief of staff, or departmental, like deputy ministers and assistant deputy ministers, are key. You're the essential train or the path to providing evidence and return on investment from existing policy and existing investments to future policy and future investments. So I wanted to kind of delve into a really practical example here that some of you may have worked on, and that would be the Global Fund Resource Mobilization Campaign in 2022. So for those of you who maybe are familiar with that campaign, the ask from civil society and from the Global Fund was to increase Canada's investment, or Canada's full investment request was $1.2 billion. The most important way for that to move forward within the political decision-making process was to be able to show that the last time Canada donated its investment into Global Fund, it was actually effective. And so both civil society stakeholders, as well as the Global Fund itself, produced very specific documents that showed the impacts and the return on investment for the initial funding, for the last tranche of funding that was provided in 2018. The best way to advance policy and the best way to influence outcomes of funding is to show the impact of existing policy or existing funding. The government's entire bottom line at the end of the day is how their investments are actually providing the change that they have committed to providing. And one of the things, you might remember that there's departments that are embroiled in scandals because it seems like the government cannot provide the impact or the evidence that any of their investments have actually made the change. And so in those kinds of situations, you might see government shirk away or become less willing to invest in something in the future because of that kind of mentality. And so the more that stakeholders and government can work together as a two-way street, hand in hand, where we provide them with the evidence, we provide them with the impact, and we provide them with the return on investment for existing projects, the more likely we're able to see that the more likely that they're able to see the decisions that they've made have mattered and that they've provided cover for Canadians to continue to invest in those areas. Sometimes it doesn't always work. For example, we've seen budget cuts in the past, and despite showing impact, despite demonstrating need, despite being able to say that, these are the investments that are needed to move forward, we'll receive a budget cut. And again, that comes back to the idea that policymaking is slow. And so sometimes policy priorities within government will change. And the important part of seeing a policy go backward is to not feel dejected, but to feel more empowered to be able to say, okay, well, this is the evidence that I now need to provide in order to move things forward. What's really important is to be able to use your resources and sector resources to advance your policy work. And that's where that impact piece comes in. So for example, CanWatch creates the CanWatch Global Health Impact Report on a yearly basis. It's a great comprehensive resource demonstrating both the overall context of global health challenges, gaps and priorities, and details specific impacts of projects and partnerships. And what you should be able to feel comfortable with is being able to use and rely on other sector resources to advance some of these policy things and come together in consultations and in collaboration with each other to advance policy priorities. That's where that building effective coalitions pieces comes in. In international development and global health, because we are not really a money-making part of government, we're more of an impact part of government, and mostly that impact is outside of our borders. There is strength in numbers and there is strength in building partnerships to show the work that we're doing has impact and is organized, productive, and efficient. There are numbers of coalitions that are already underway, and we're going to get to one in a second with our conversation with Martin. But a coalition is one of the most effective ways to demonstrate how important an issue is, how broadly the impact is of that issue or investment will resonate, and what that means both to Canada and to Canada's partners. The one thing I think that's important to recognize about Canada is that it is important to Canada how the rest of the world perceives us, both with respect to the G7, as well as respect to other stakeholders and other partners in the global policymaking world. That's different for every country. And so being able to have a coalition which is able to demonstrate that broad swath of impact, that influence, and the importance of that influence, I think really matters to the way that we work here in Canada and the way that government works in Canada. One example is, for example, the number of working groups that CanWatch has that bring folks together in coalition groups, in working groups to advance different policy ideas and ideations. And that, I think, is a great way not only to understand each other's priorities, but to align so that our priorities work in the government priorities and KPIs, and build your resources, your talking points, and your messaging campaigns around that. All right, I'm just going to do a quick little check in the chat. And I think with that, I am going to invite Martin Fisher from World Vision to talk about the Bill C-41 and the Afghanistan investments, not trade. You know, I'm going to pass it over to Martin.
Thanks, Sabrina. And I was looking through the participant list, and it's great to see folks that have been part of this effort. And I do want to give a shout out to Melissa Garcia, who's used to be at CARE, is now somewhere else. But Melissa and I were, I think, co-conspirators in the very early days of this, of the effort that I'm going to describe. So it's good to see you on here, Melissa, and others as well. Sabrina talked about sort of policy engagement, policy articulation, and in that comment you said something that we don't often do as a sector, which is legislative work. So what I will talk about for the next little while actually is a coalition effort to address a legislative barrier through legislative change. So in order to do that, I have to rewind the clock just about 2 years when in August of 2021, in Afghanistan, we saw the violent takeover of the Taliban, of the democratically elected government, that obviously both led to a deterioration of the humanitarian situation as well as a political situation, most notably for women and girls. And in Canada, for Canadian partners or Canadian branches of international NGOs, but also local Canadian humanitarian partners, in the fall of 2021, we sort of heard from the government, hey, there's a problem here. And the problem that they presented to us was that the Taliban is on the list of terrorist entities in Canada, and as a result, the criminal code of Canada would kick in and prohibit any direct or indirect support to Afghanistan where there could be a trickle down of money to the Taliban because they are a listed terrorist entity. What that meant was that Global Affairs Canada, but also other arms of government, froze any money that they themselves were sending. They stopped proposals that had Afghanistan as a component. They froze projects that were active in Afghanistan. And with that came assessments from many organizations, boards, that it would be too risky to funnel private funds to Afghanistan because it was this risk of criminal prosecution because of that anti-terror provision of the criminal code. Anybody who wants to geek out on the criminal code can go to section 8303, 09, and 08. And some of us have become amateur lawyers throughout this. So I remember the call that I got from a programs colleague that says, Martin, we've got a problem. And nobody really completely understood what the solution could be at the time. They just sort of said, this is the problem in the code. The code doesn't provide for any solutions, really. We can't give you a letter. We can't give you assurances of non-prosecution. And it took a really small number of months for folks to wrap their head around what exactly the legal problem was. So that was in the fall, early winter of 2021. Then early, when the government was reelected, I think the Conservatives at the time pushed them to establish a special committee for Afghanistan. So in the deepest, darkest winter of 2021-22, the committee looked at the situation in Afghanistan, and the first thing they looked at was the humanitarian crisis. So at that point, I remember it was RCO Michael Messenger and Barbara Grantham from CARE and others rang the alarm bells at that special committee and said, there's a real problem here. We're unable to support work in Afghanistan. And parliamentarians were really aware of it, but they became really, really concerned with it. And there was a recommendation that this needed to be fixed somehow. That came out in the spring of 2022. And then, and Sabrina, right, in your thing said policy work is slow. Well, legislative work sometimes is even slower, especially if the problem isn't perceived as a problem by the government, right? So there was a problem, obviously, that the humanitarian situation was terrible. And some politicians sort of were aware of it. And there were staffing changes, Sabrina, right? You alluded to that, sort of people turnover. So it took us a while to articulate solutions and to sort of say, these are some possible solutions. And we work really closely with some really great in-house lawyers as well as sector lawyers to present some ideas. And the government at the time said, well, no, those are no good. No, can't do that, can't do that, can't do that. And we all got really frustrated. And the frustration really sort of led to, and this is what Sabrina also alluded to, coalitions, led to a whole bunch of organizations becoming collectively frustrated in the early summer of 2022, when we said, well, there's a first anniversary, really grim first anniversary of the government falling in Afghanistan coming. We have to sort of raise the alarm bells here and say that Canadians can't support this, the government can't support it, and we can't. So that led, and I know there's folks from Islamic Relief on the call, that led to the formation of this Aid for Afghanistan coalition, because Rihanna at the time suggested for us to form a coalition that allows us to say things much louder than we could ever wanted to do individually, because there's always risk. But also just the power of collective action. So this coalition, Aid for Afghanistan, was created mostly to drum up some public attention in the summer, last summer, just about a year ago. So we launched that in the summer of 2022, and it kind of irritated the government. I remember I was on vacation, and I remember a chief of staff calling people and saying, what's going on here? Which meant that we were doing the right things. And it was being noticed. And they were kind of like, how can we fix this? How can we fix this? Well, have you been asleep at the wheel for a year? We've suggested some things, right? But those were bumping up against legal advice from government lawyers who said this cannot be fixed unless, and this is then where I'm really sprinting through this, where in the fall of 2022, it was clear that the only way to fix all of this was by changing the criminal code. And I'm really going to sprint through it. There was a Senate hearing before I get to the effort, the beauty of a coalition. There was a Senate hearing that recommended that the code be changed in ways that then led to increasing, and there's lots of media coverage, Dylan Robertson from the Canadian Press being a rock star on this, that led to the government really feeling the pressure because there were other pressure points on Afghanistan, right? There was the immigration promise that they were having a hard time fulfilling. There was a whole bunch of other things wrapped up in Afghanistan that led them to announcing that they would change the criminal code through it by introducing Bill C-41. We are now several months out from that introduction early this spring, and we are firmly positive that this bill, an improved version of what was tabled, a not sufficiently improved, but adequately improved version of the bill will pass before Parliament rises for the summer break, and that we won't, that was our goal, have a second anniversary of the takeover of the Taliban without having to fix this problem. In all of this, right, there's a long legislative process, there's a long articulation of solutions sort of process, but really why all of this worked, in my mind, is for two reasons. One, that the problem was very, very clear, and although the solutions weren't all that clear and they crystallized over time, once it became clear that the code needed to be changed, it was a lot easier to sort of say, well, this is how it could be changed, and this is what it needs to look like, and to be propositional to the government in terms of what a bill should and would look like. And the other reason is why it worked is because it was a very strong complementary coalition that brought together sort of all the critical skills, experiences, and personalities that you need to drive something like this. So you had really well thought out, very simple but well thought out public engagement that had a coalition, but it also made it clear to Canadians what the problem was and why politicians needed to act. You had, and I think that's unique for this effort, a really great group of lawyers working on sort of the technical part, right? Sabrina spoke about technical expertise. In this particular case, the technical expertise that we needed was legal. And there's not a big group of in-house counsels throughout the sector, but the folks that are around really do know what they're doing. And I think that will be advantageous for the sector going forward, that having a group of lawyers who are vested and understand this, working on a solution is really good. Then you had GR folks that sort of, and in that sort of a small number of experienced folks around the legislative process, but they were also able to tap people outside. And then, and I mean, you talked about policy change, Sabrina. It wasn't as much policy as it was legal. So like the lawyers were the policy people, right? In essence, where you sometimes have health policy experts. And then last and not least, really important, obviously, and I know Patrick from SAVE is on the call, the humanitarian programs folks as well, right? To sort of say, this is why this is a problem, right? And this is how it's presenting itself in Afghanistan. And obviously our people on the ground continuously sounding the alarm bells and saying Canada is an outlier, right? Like Canada is the last country to have fixed this when it does get fixed in the next little while. So I guess all that to say, and to use Bill C-41, even though it is an outlier in the kind of policy and GR work because it's legislative, it's not policy formulation, right? It doesn't have any money ask attached to it. Maybe that's why they've been so patient with us. But it works when you have a group of organizations that feel a sense of urgency to either to fix something. And I mean, Megan's here, and when you have a group of individuals that like one another, I think that's really, really important, right? In this kind of, can get really dark sometimes when you get frustrated by people responding, unless you have sort of a group of people that you trust and that you've worked with for a number of years, where you can vent at times and be frustrated, but then also solution oriented. To me, that's kind of a key component of how this work gets done. If you can't work with people or if you sort of have this sense, well, I have to, sorry, Megan, I have to work with Megan, but I don't like Megan. Well, I do like Megan, but then it gets really complicated, right? But if you have people that truly, where there's a chemistry and where there's a synergy, then really complicated things like this thing can actually be accomplished. So I'll pause there. And I did ramble on a little bit. I hope that was okay, Sabrina.
No, that was perfect. That's exactly what I was hoping. But yeah, I think that's really important that this was like a legislative change as opposed to a policy change. But I think also at the end of the day, given this legislative work we've done, we also now, as a sector, as a coalition on this project, understand the policy changes that may need to occur in the future, so that this can be the normal status, or like, if we were ever to for example, face this situation in a different country, Haiti or Iraq or Iran, I think it's important to be able to recognize that this was legislated, but there could be policy impacts down the line. And I just wanted to pick up on the last thing that you said, Martin, that this wasn't about money. And I think it's important to recognize that the work that sectors do, whether it's this sector or other sectors, can't always be about money and can't always be about asking the government for money without showing that impact and without building that goodwill on legislation or policy or engaging Canadians, because that's when we won't get anything done or we won't get any investments into the future. So I actually think it's important that we showcase policy successes that aren't about money, because it's just as equally as important for shaping Canada's role in the world and in the sector.
And just, sorry, Sabrina, just one other thing as a lesson from this, because I know sometimes the sector engages, I mean, obviously global affairs is sort of our home base, right? But, and I mean, Thrive is a really good example of that, where you had other departments being really, really critical. But I think, especially when you look at policy and specifically legislative change, it's not always just GAC, right? There's often other departments who are perhaps even more important. And I think C41 is, for better, a long time for worse, but actually now for better. It the solution hasn't come from global affairs. The problem has presented itself to global affairs, but perhaps that's why it took so long, because we really needed to understand how public safety and the Justice Department operate, right? And I mean, those were black boxes for many of us, and we as stakeholders were completely blank slate for them, right? They could care less whether a coalition of 18 humanitarian organizations is annoyed. I mean, but what they do care about, and I think coming back to this framing thing, is whether or not the government was perceived as being responsive to the situation in Afghanistan in light of sort of the historical obligations that Canada has. So that's just, I think, oftentimes we always when we look at problems as a sector, our immediate often, and I know I'm talking about global health folks, our immediate sort of port of call is either global affairs and sometimes health, but there's a whole host of other shops, right, that need to be understood, especially on the policy formulation side, in order to drive effective change.
I think the other thing, just building on that, with respect to like specific policy and legislative changes, is like, a lot of that work needs to be done outside of the minister's office as well. And there's opportunities to build those relationships and build those impact reporting and understanding with MPs that represent a certain diaspora and, might represent communities where international assistance is more important in that community because of remittance, because of other things that they do, because of a high number of international students or international workers. And so being able to understand the context in which you're operating, and again, building that relationship using your key resources, the things that you've produced as an organization and the things that you can deliver, and building those relationships with MPs is important. And I think that helps even strengthen the ask when you're looking to make legislative change, because now it's not just, the minister's voice around the table, but there's like 20 caucus members' voices around the table. So I think that that's a really important kind of piece. I'm not seeing any questions yet in the chat, but I have a question for you, Martin. So I think you've kind of talked about this a little bit, but in overcoming an issue like this, where folks are unfamiliar, what would you say, like maybe like 1, 2, 3, like what are the kind of steps that you would engage in to move something along internally within your coalition and externally?
So externally, I think, especially in this particular case, where you dealt with members of parliament in their true role as legislators, which is unique for us sometimes, right? So I think having them boiling down the problem in a way that is really graspable, is easy to understand for them. And as much as I dislike framing international assistance, especially humanitarian assistance, as sending stuff, and we did on this particular instance framed it as like there's stuff sitting in places and we're unable to send it. That, when we tried to explain, well, we can't do the work that is more complicated, right? They're kind of, well, I can't get that. And then we kind of boiled it down, thanks actually to Dylan from the Canadian Press, who picked that up and say, and it's not because of World Vision, but like we used that quote. We said we had ready to use therapeutic foods that in containers ready to go, and we had to stop. That's the problem, right? And kids are dying because of that. Then I recall sort of members of that special committee understand all of a sudden be like, well, that's not good. And so we often talk, yeah. So I think to me that's one externally, like really breaking it down. And with the staffers in the other ministers' offices, it was like, we understand this is not number 1, 2, 3 of your issue, but surely Afghanistan is an issue for your ministers, and it is an issue for your government, right? So it was about framing it in a way that was problematic for them, where they needed to find a solution to this particular issue, without saying that the problem is this particular issue just for you, but really sort of saying you have an Afghanistan cloud hanging over you, and this is one element of that cloud that you need to remove quickly. Otherwise, you cannot say that you are a feminist government purporting to advance feminist values internationally, where they are being violated the most egregiously in Afghanistan. And internally, I think it was really, again, like, this is complimentary of ourselves. There was nobody ever saying like, my organization has to do this, or we have to be presented this way. It was always like, well, we can do this, we can add this value, we can add this value, and if that's helpful, that's okay, and if not, then that's also okay. And I think in part that helped because it was so complicated, right? And people were experimental, and we tried things and allowed ourselves to sort of fail and then figure out what was next. Because we didn't know what the solution was. I don't know if that was, I think that was an answer to your question.
Wonderful. Okay, I'm seeing one other question. So I'm going to ask this, Martin, and I think this will be our last question. I don't see very many others. How did could you elaborate a little bit on how you brought the coalition together, or how the coalition came together in terms of the membership, and maybe what the how the coalition interacted with the legislative process? So was there a spokesperson? Was there multiple people? Like, what was the engagement process there?
So how this originated was through HPAG, which is the Humanitarian Policy and Advocacy Group that meets regularly at the time. Yeah, it was sort of monthly, right? And in that month, relatively loose working group, and people come and share mostly, and like not as and for several months, right, members were sharing that this was an issue. And I think it came out of that during one meeting in June, last year, where Islamic Relief came and said, this is all, we've all talked about this for months. How would people feel about creating a coalition and doing a joint, at that time, a joint public campaign? So that's how, so you had this relatively loose working group that then out of that came a purpose focused group with just this somewhat self-selected, right? People think initially people sort of, yeah, I'll do that, I'll do that, I'll do that, and then grew to like this 18 logos on there. That doesn't mean that all 18 members are always active. So what happened for that when we met, I think relatively regularly, especially in the fall last year, and then out of that grew, I would say, a smaller sort of core group that drove the legislative process. So that was, but always looping in, yeah, right now weekly or bi-weekly and actually daily, right? The other folks and sort of saying, does this make sense? Does this make sense? Does this make sense? And then when it came to the actual sort of parliamentary engagements, anything that was public, it somehow crystallized that it was myself and one of the lawyers from the Red Cross, because the pieces that were needed in those instances were some awareness of where this was politically, as well as then the technical legal expertise. But it was always like brought, and the most important, and that legal piece, there was like a group of lawyers that have been meeting every Friday for lunch that hashed all of this out on the truly legal side. So you had a big group, smaller group, and then somewhat smaller group doing sort of the actual work, and then, but that, yeah, is that an answer? I think so.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And just kind of picking up on that, I think with respect to coalition work in the sector, unfortunately, this is one of those sectors where I think sometimes the government's like, here's some scraps, fight over them. And so I think it's important as organizations to really come together and think about some of those bigger goals in a collaborative way, because I think that sometimes this is a sector that is pitted against one another, but by design of government resourcing, not by design of how we choose to operate with each other. And that is important when we discuss how, as a coalition, we engage either in legislative or policy changes versus financial changes, right? Or financial investments, sorry. And I think that's why so often the actual calls that we've had where we come together for these large pools of money, whether that is the Thrive commitment, the 10-year commitment to global health, whether that is the increase on global SRHR, or whether that is on resource mobilization campaigns like Global Fund or GFF, that those are often the most effective because we have really clear and aligned goals together. And I think that it's important to be able to identify those and recognize those with respect to those massive investments that we can then carve into smaller pieces as we engage with government, but to not let that being pitted against each other mentality feed upwards into these large asks, because those large asks are so important for the survival of the sector. And I think at the end of the day, regardless of how the government perceives the impact of these investments to be unfolding in Canada, it's our job to be able to prove that they are unfolding. And I think that's where you bring in other groups like the diaspora, like the charitable sector in terms of employment. The sector employs, thousands of people that are, and that when you talk about job creation, that's important. And so that I think is like how you would maybe play some of those pieces. So
just
okay.
sorry,
Yeah,
Sabrina, I don't want to forget, obviously, I mean, it presented this now as an effort, right? As one of the efforts that has led to this solution. But I mean, you mentioned diaspora communities several times. So I think it's really key. There is both in the coalition represented through Canadian Women for Women in Afghanistan, but also a very vocal and influential group of mostly Afghan women, right, that have engaged on this, given just this, and have pushed specifically Minister Sajjan, but also others on this issue, right? And I think that's, sometimes we forget, especially when you're doing GR, you can sometimes get to the point where you have to check yourself of, am I sanitizing this issue? I use that term. Am I removing the actual problem on the ground from the issue too much, and I'm presenting just the solution. I think that's always something that we all run a risk of. And I think in this particular case, having had that really, really strong parallel, at times joint, but also certainly always complementary sort of effort from Afghan Canadian activists, probably it has been tremendously helpful and certainly super complementary to all of this.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Martin, for your perspective and for providing that wonderful overview of the work. And we wish you continued success in getting that done. I know it's in like final committee stages right now. So the last part that we wanted to discuss here is a bit more on the practical side of like how you would actually maximize your consultations and engagement with government stakeholders. So there's a bit of this in the one pager that we provided, but I just wanted to be really concise about the ways in which we interact with government and the opportunities to use those interactions to advance your priorities. So outside of the engagements that you might have with the department, these are more on the political processes that you can use. There are often official consultations that are put out by the government that are a key way for you to provide direct feedback and input into government policymaking and prioritization, as well as an opportunity to show the results and impact of the work, either from your organization or more broadly as a sector, which helps build the credibility of our sector generally with government. So there's examples. For example, one example is the SDG Voluntary National Review. That was a consultation put out by government, I think, in March of this year. And it was an opportunity for all sorts of organizations, both domestic facing and international facing, to indicate the ways in which the SDGs have advanced through their work. There's also generally consultations that open up from global affairs on things right now, for example, on the economic cooperation strategy that they are building, that the government is building with the African continent. And one of the things, though, I think is important is that these consultations are not always going to be handed to you. So despite your relationship with GAC, despite your relationship with government, sometimes you may miss a consultation. So it's important to be a little bit proactive in following things like the GC Newsroom on Twitter, or following and subscribing to like the feeds from Global Affairs Canada, not just Minister Sajjan's feeds, but also Jolie and also Minister Ng. The thing about consultations is that often I think they are very well intended and they do a really good job of getting comprehensive viewpoints and getting comprehensive engagement, but sometimes they're a box ticking exercise and sometimes they're not well publicized. And so making sure that you are a little bit on it, subscribing to those news feeds, subscribing to those Twitter notifications, also checking the Canada Gazette is an important way to really be on top of what the government is putting out and where the policy issues are. We're all busy, and I know it's a lot of work to be able to like keep on top of the monitoring and analysis of what government's putting out, but it is an important way to be able to get some of that information. And if you see something and you're like, oh, that's piqued my interest, then you can dig a little bit deeper. But this way, it just kind of provides a steady stream of information to your inbox. So when you do consultations, I think it's important to recognize that on one side, the consultation is for government and it's be able to provide your credibility and your record and impact into the policy making, but it's also an opportunity to build your case and build your policy credibility from a public side. And so sometimes you may choose to, for example, make official consultations public, or you may choose to take a public consultation and turn it into an op-ed or a briefing note. And I think it's important that you do that when you think that the information you're providing in this consultation will build your credibility, will build your relationship, and will build the knowledge and understanding of Canadians on the sector or on the issue that we're talking about. You can also use that to show internal value inside your organization if you have members or if you have other departments that rely on that information as valuable. The second main way to engage with government on some of these important issues is committee processes. So there's two key committees that I would say you would want to be really in tune to the work of those committees. And again, that's done by subscribing to the feeds of the committees and just regularly checking that work. And that's on the one pager. The first one is the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs. It's the main parliamentary committee which would engage with the international development and global health sector. You can monitor their page to engage in key studies and committee work to reinforce the policy perspectives we've spoken about today and the impact that Canada can have in the outcomes of this work. What's important when you engage with committee is to ensure that the briefings and submissions you're providing are done more broadly with a nonpartisan lens. Committees are cross-partisan. It's an opportunity for opposition parties to critique, to interrogate, and to get more information out of the government than they can in a question period. And so it's important that when we present to committee or that when we make submissions to committees, that work represents a bit of a nonpartisan lens where all parliamentarians can see the value of the work that we're doing. On occasion, the position that we've taken may lend itself naturally to being more on one side than the other. For example, in the recent study on global SRHR, obviously, I think it lended itself more likely towards an NDP or liberal-leaning parliamentarian. But it's important that overall, the impact and the way in which you make the submissions is a little bit more broad-based. And I know we're almost at time, so I'm going to do this in about 5 minutes. I haven't seen any questions pop up so far. And with committees, there are opportunities either to engage through a submission. For example, the recent study that the FAEE did on global health and SRHR. There's also an opportunity to engage through a committee appearance. Committee appearances can also be combined with a submission. So in order to achieve getting a committee appearance, you would want to either email the clerk of the committee, which can be found on their website, or you would want to build your relationship with a parliamentarian on that committee who will then request your presence during a hearing. And so those are kind of the ways in which, as I mentioned before, as you build those relationships with parliamentarians, including people that are not ministers, provide them with the impact of the work that you're doing, that they might say, okay, this person's valuable. I know that we're talking about this. I want my office to reach out to them, to get them on a committee so that we can make sure that, we hear their perspective. The other committee that's important would be the Finance Committee, and that's more on the pre-budget submission side. Generally, I would say the only interactions from our sector with finance would be on pre-budget, but on foreign affairs, there's multiple different angles in which this sector will engage from a humanitarian perspective, global health perspective, international development perspective. And then the last two pieces I will say on committee studies is that building an effective relationship with parliamentarians, including those outside of minister's office, is what will influence the development of studies in committee. And so, for example, the vaccine study, which occurred, I believe, two sessions ago, or maybe it was this session, a lot of that, the impetus for that study came from civil society pushing for a department or pushing for parliamentarians on that committee to re-look at the impact of the vaccine program in Canada and the way in which vaccines were delivered around the world. And so you can not only just participate in what the government's already doing, you can actually influence the government to study something that they're already not engaged in. And that can happen on the political side, like a committee, or that can happen on the departmental side with global affairs, if you're able to make that package a reason for investigation. And one of the ways in which to do that is using current events to your advantage. So the reason why the vaccine study was so apparent and so easy is because it was in the news, because there was a lot of engagement on the World Health Organization, the pandemic draft was developing. And so there was a reason for parliamentarians to study it. Ukraine is another example where there's a reason for parliamentarians to be engaged in this right now. And so you can use those current events that shape the engagement of foreign policy, shape international development, and shape international investments to your advantage in moving conversations forward at the time. And I think it's important to be able to recognize the context of the work that we do in those current events so that we don't get left behind where our policy points don't resonate with the things that a government might be hearing from people on the ground, which is the most important voice that they're ever going to hear on making decisions, whether financial or policy related. So I will stop there and I will stop sharing my screen. I haven't seen any other questions pop up in the chat, but if you do, please feel free to put them in there. I'm also going to pop my email in the chat if anyone has a message or a question that they'd like to ask later. And I think outside of that, I don't have anything else to say except to say thank you for all joining. I hope that you found this valuable. We will be following up with the one-pager and with a feedback survey. And yeah, I hope that you enjoy the rest of CanWatch Academy. There's many other sessions to happen. Thank you for doing this at 3 p.m. on a Monday. And I feel like we can end.
Thanks, Sabrina. Thanks, everyone.